Welcome back to the Valisites podcast, where FP&A, CFOs, controllers, and operators come for practical, future-proof ways to run finance. Today's guest is one of the most trusted instructors and advisors in modern FP&A and CFO practice. Carl Seidman is a Microsoft MVP, certified speaking professional, and CPA who has trained over 100,000 finance pros on Excel, cash flow forecasting, one of my favorites, dynamic modeling, and advisory skills. He leads Seidman Financial, teaches at Rice University, and runs cohort programs that upskill teams at brands you definitely know, and we'll chat about them. Carl's famous for turning real-world messy into clean, dynamic models, from the 13-week cash flow to driver-based scenarios, and for showing how FP&A becomes a true decision engine, not a reporting function. In this episode, we're going to dig into dynamic Excel and why modern modeling changes the job, building resilient 13-week cash flows that actually guide our decision-making, FP&A versus controllership and where the lines should be and where they get blurred. Another one of my favorites, Capex planning that ties to revenue, cash, and capacity. And finally, what Copilot, Microsoft Copilot and Excel means for the next era of finance work. Carl, this is a dream come true. Such a pleasure. Welcome to the Valisites podcast.
Thanks much, Albert. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I have loved all of the educational material you've been putting out there on LinkedIn. You have been busy. You've been busy. I see you nonstop. And I think the algorithm's promoting it even more. And it's amazing for all us financial professionals out there. It's been really
good. I appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, you've trained over 100,000 finance professionals, as I mentioned. What themes keep repeating across companies and industries that you tackle?
I think one of the biggest issues is a lot of people just don't know what alternatives exist to the way that they've always done their work. I think that if you go through school or you go to a training or you go onto YouTube or you go onto LinkedIn, wherever your exposure is, that's what you've seen, that's what you know. And so oftentimes when people come into my lane, it's, well, I've never seen anything like that before. And I say, well, why not? And it's not that it's that much more advanced or robust or anything. It's just that people haven't seen it before. And so I think one of the issues that I often see is that people work in their own bubbles or their own silos, and it's just a lack of awareness or lack of familiarity with what's out there. I also think that people tend to find themselves getting, I don't want to say specialized, but they end up getting really good at what they're really good at. And then they tend to double down and triple down and quadruple down on what that is. And while that's great to become so centric and specialized, it often means that you're not exploring and not seeing what else is out there outside of the realm of what you're doing on a daily or weekly basis.
It's so funny you say that, and I've seen that. I've heard the chatter. I've had some great conversations. Sometimes we stick to the classic way of doing things, even in Excel, the classic formulas. And what I love about what you do is you challenge the status quo and show, and actually demo, by the way, I love your demos. You demo the alternative ways, the dynamic Excel. Can you walk us through that? I think there's Scan and LAMBDA and all of that. You've been really trying to get out there and show us, hey, here's a different way to do it. And it's even easier.
Yeah, I think I think it might be just kind of in my bones. I think it might just be a personal philosophy and value system that I have is, even from when I was a young analyst or associate, it was always, well, this is the way I know how to do something. It was even my answer just two seconds ago to what you asked is, well, this is the way that I've always done it. This is the one way I know how. And I was always encountering issues where I would say, there's got to be a better way to do this. Like, this cannot be the only way. And so I think just my value system and what I've always strived to do is to say, is this really the best way? What are the alternatives? And what it started to force me to do is to say, well, there are a lot of different ways. They're all potentially good, but this is why this way is better, this way is worse, this way is better, this way is worse. And I think it just challenges your existing mindset of, rather than saying, I'm an expert, I know the best way, is to say, I probably am not an expert. There's probably a dozen ways to do this. What's the right way? So I think that is really important in education. I think that's really important in your career, to not have blinders on and say, the way that I've been doing it is the best way to do it.
Right. Any specific favorite examples, maybe even recent examples where you took what was maybe a stagnant kind of classic way of building an FP&A model, and with your mentorship, whether it be in the classroom or out in the public private space, where this dynamic FP&A model actually made forecasting more powerful and actually even more accurate. Any examples?
Yeah, I'll give a couple of examples. And before I do, though, I often share this paradigm because I teach at consulting firms and I teach at universities and I teach at Fortune 500s. And it's not that I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm doing the work for them, I'm showing them how to do the work. So it's like instead of giving a man a fish, it's teaching a man how to fish and being in control of their own destiny. But the paradigm that I often share is you can either do something that is simpler and less robust and hope that you don't lose people. You can do something that's more advanced or more modern and more robust, but risk losing people. But then the third option is you can do something that is more modern and more robust, and then you can teach somebody how to do it. And it doesn't have to be something that takes hours or days. Like it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes. And so I was teaching something to, I run an FP&A mastermind. I was teaching to my FP&A mastermind the let function, which is relatively new at the time of this recording. And when you go through it, it's to make this very simple, it's basically saying all of these nested formulas and all of these multiple step calculations that you're doing, you don't have to do that anymore across multiple rows or multiple columns or multiple cells. You don't have to create these really nasty long formulas. You can really categorize them and label different elements and make it very easy to follow. So I introduced it to my group, and within like the first 60 seconds of introducing it, people are like, oh, no, that's way too advanced. We're not going to do that. That's too complicated. And I said, hold on a second. Let's unwrap this. Let's break it down. And so instead of doing this really robust dynamic calculation, which, by the way, allows you to essentially automate your payments. Right. You can automate your tax payments, you can automate your payables, you can automate your debt service. I mean, this is like what FP&A software often does, but you can do it with an Excel. It just takes a little bit of extra baking. But so I unwrapped it, I made it simpler, and then by the end of this 5-minute tutorial, people are like, oh, that's actually really easy. And so you've got to give people these incremental baby steps of this is what you're doing, this is what you could be doing different, this is why what you're doing is great, this is why what you're doing is terrible. And it weighs the balances. So you can use some of this dynamic functionality, again, using something like let, that at the surface looks like it's complicated, but when you really seek to understand how these techniques work, it ends up making your life so much easier.
Sure. I'd imagine, and you probably get this all the time, finance professionals that become aware of some of these new dynamic ways of doing and building their models. They have an existing one. They're like, Carl, I don't want to break it. I have an existing model here. I already did all this legwork. No need to upgrade or use these different paths. What's your response to that? And how do you ensure whatever was created as an existing model isn't broken?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in my philosophy on that's changed over the years, because when I was a little bit younger, I would always have this mindset of, oh, there's always a better way. This is the better way. You should be doing this. And as a consultant, as an advisor, as a professor, as a teacher, I've changed my mindset from that, where I've said, I shouldn't contest what you're doing. I should meet you where you are, but then also give you introductions to what is possible. So it's almost like, when you meet somebody who's struggling in their personal life, I think it becomes very easy to be prescriptive and offer them all these solutions of what they should do to fix their situation.
Yeah.
But it ignores the reality of where they are, what they're struggling with, their psychology, their workload, all of these dynamics, all of these pressures. And so even though you could say, here are recommendations that I would make, you can't force that on somebody and say, well, you're foolish for not taking it. You have to understand who they are and where they're coming from and the right placement. And so what I tend to do is if I go into a company in a FP&A advisory context, or I'm training, is I'll take a look at their file and I say, I understand what you're doing here. Have you thought about this as an alternative? Or can I show you something? This would probably simplify what you're doing. And it's not up to me whether they accept it or not, but the best I can do is say, here are alternatives. Here's why the alternative might be more favorable. And it's up to you to decide what path you want to go.
I love that. And I love that approach because we're all at different points, right? And I know we're talking about both personal, but professionally too, and this takes a lot of work. I love that you talk a lot about cash flow statements and scenario based modeling and all of that. It takes a lot of work. So to meet people where they're at and just finding different avenues, I love that approach. It's a very teacher approach. I appreciate that about you. And it's so helpful to meet others where they're at. Okay, so I love this transition of what you've been teaching and talking about specific to AI. It's obviously a huge buzz. And I feel like just even in the last 2 to 3 weeks, I don't know what Microsoft did, but Copilot is on another level. Can you walk us through maybe a few things just must do with Microsoft Copilot when it comes to Excel?
Yeah, so I'm going to share a couple of pathways. And I wrote the Copilot in Excel for FP&A course for LinkedIn Learning. So I got to go through that experience. Also, as an MVP, I get to see and witness what Microsoft is doing behind the curtain. And what's interesting is when you go through the capabilities of Copilot, some people think it's remarkable and some people are very underwhelmed. And the way that I often explain it to people is if you're already quite seasoned and you know your way through the tool, and taking a step outside of your normal routine would slow you down, Copilot might not help you that much. However, the majority of Excel users, and I might even bridge outside of this because Copilot's not just specific to Excel, it's unique to all Microsoft. And so if you are in the majority of people all over the world, the hundreds of millions of people who are using Microsoft products, inclusive and exclusive of Excel, and you say, I just want to save time. I want to be more efficient. I want to, brew up better ideas. I want it to suggest alternatives to what I'm doing. It's a remarkable tool. And so what I explain to people is I say, it depends on what your use cases are. You don't go all in, you don't go all out. It's saying, what are your use cases? I'll be candid and say my use of Copilot in Excel will probably slow me down more than it will build me up. But for the majority of people, it's probably the opposite. Whereas I would say, I love Copilot for PowerPoint. I had a workshop I was doing, I'm trying to think when this was, maybe about a year ago. And I was under a really, really tight deadline. This was a company, pretty large corporation, came to me with very, very little turnaround to deliver this workshop. They said, we need a guy. We heard you're the guy. We've got a program in front of 200 people. You're going to do it virtually. Oh, and by the way, it's next week. And so I was like, oh, wow, I've got the content, but to put together a PowerPoint or slides for this is going to be a pretty tall order. So I took my notes, my outline, even some parts of a script and even some data, and I used Copilot in PowerPoint, and it put something together that was not perfect by any stretch, but it probably took me 75% of the way that I would have done all myself. And so it probably saved me hours, if not days of work. And so when it comes to AI, Copilot, or otherwise, is think about your use cases, think about where it makes sense to use, and ignore it for the rest.
That's great advice because I get a lot of that around just the governance piece when you're using Copilot. Let's use Copilot, for example, or AI, any type of large language model, securely, obviously, but with financial data, even financial workflow. I'm curious on what your thoughts are on how you govern those outputs, right? Like even you mentioned PowerPoint, right? I know it's not financial, but using some data or even putting it all together, it got you 75% of the way there. What are your thoughts on that? On how much can this be trusted, and should there continue to be human in the loop in everything that we do specifically when it comes to financial data?
Yeah, Albert, I think that's the $1 trillion question, and I don't think that there is a perfect answer today. Even in the Copilot for Excel course that I did for LinkedIn Learning, there was a chapter that I made where I didn't illustrate anything. It was just talking about the ethics, the liability, the negligence, the data security aspects of AI. And I finished the chapter not really giving an answer, of just saying that these are questions that we should be asking. And I applaud you for even raising it, of saying, yeah, these are wonderful tools. They can save a ton of time. They can take a lot of, rote, routine kinds of tasks that we do, and allow us to focus our time elsewhere. But the problem is we often don't know where our data is going. And what I can say is, with a lot of these large language models, they are being trained on our data. So they came out being trained on public information, and then also probably some pirated private information. But now it's like it's building on what it's building upon what it's building on. And so every piece of data that's going on is new intelligence for it. So I agree with you that to upload your own data is extremely dangerous. I don't do that for my own personal information. I don't do that for clients. However, there are a lot of FP&A tools that have been very thoughtful of saying, there's a firewall. Your data, client data, does not leave our platform. And even though we're leveraging some of the technology that exists with a third party, your data stays here. And so I think that that's extremely thoughtful. It's very smart and strategic, because the moment that company data starts getting out there and you do a search and you end up getting confidential information that you shouldn't have, that's a lawsuit.
Not a good
so I think that we need to be thoughtful and ask those questions that you are. And then, as software providers, of saying, how far do we take this, and what's too far?
Yeah, it's a must. I know there's a lot of great companies that do add those different layers, firewalls, layers of security. We do something similar at Sites, and even anonymize certain things, so that you're right, so that information doesn't get out into the wrong hands. It's just something you don't want to mess with.
No, it's not worth it. I think, to your point, is it's not worth it to be able to go even further with capabilities. Pull back on the capabilities so that you're 100% confident in where your data is and what's being done with it.
Right, exactly. Well, something that I love that you chat about quite often, because for what I do, I actually lift up the hood, and in many cases, a cash flow forecast or any type of cash flow model is just non-existent till this day, right? And I get it. Even growing up, while my education's back in finance, in a lot of other spaces, whether it's high school, college, there's just not a lot of good financial education, financial literacy. So typically, when I lift up the hood to a business, an owner has no idea what a cash flow statement is. They're just looking at the income statement. You spend a lot of time there. What are the most common traits of a good, like some of the best 13-week cash flows that you've seen?
I would say there's a few traits. Is one, I actually had a conversation with a student of mine in my mastermind yesterday. And while we weren't talking cash flow, we were talking P&L, but the response I'm going to give you is exactly the same. It's, how detailed do you need to go versus how detailed can you go? And then that need versus can should give you the response of, if I go more detailed, it's going to cause me to make different decisions than if I didn't go deep enough. And the reason why I gave him the answer that I did is, you could spend hours building greater detail, greater capability, and if it makes no difference, who cares?
Good point.
And that's really hard for a lot of people to stomach, of saying, well, if I could get more accurate, if this can get better, why wouldn't I do that? But what is better? Just more detail, more information? If it doesn't influence any of your decisions, I would argue that it's not any better. And so I think the best cash flows are the ones that are detailed enough to give you the intelligence and foresight that you need to increase your confidence, and that also isn't a tremendous laborious exercise. So if you're having to spend hours and hours a day updating a model, it's probably not a good use of your time. But when I used to be employed at a management consulting firm, there were, myself and some of my colleagues would spend upwards of a full day, one day a week, updating cash flow models. Yeah. And if you think about what the billable rates are for that person, is that worth it?
Right.
So it's a balance between how much detail you need, the automation that makes sense to have, the amount of time that you're spending, and does it give you good outputs? If the answer is the inverse of, it takes me too much time, way too detailed, can't make decisions, you've got a bad model.
And that's where we're trying to fill the void at Valicites. To your point, it's not only the time that it takes, the billable hours that it requires if you're doing it. And I can't wait to talk to you about this next piece around weekly versus monthly cash flow statements. But what we do is we scrape the data, your AR, AP, your COA, right? And it's building out the rows. And to your point earlier, gets you 70% of the way there. People always challenge me. It's like, oh, it's not accurate. I'm like, well, no, get you 7% of the way there. And there's still human in the loop scrubbing and there's iteration, which I think is appropriate at this point in time, right? With AI, it's just not all the way there yet. It's not foolproof. But, this comes up a lot actually, and I was curious what your thoughts were on this. I got this question now a couple times. It's like, Albert, why are we talking about weekly cash flow? Why can't it just be monthly? And I'm like, I don't know. I've always done it weekly. I've maintained it weekly, and that's just what I've done. But I was curious on your opinion on this. Does it matter? Does the industry business model, like when should it be weekly versus monthly, or should it always be weekly? Should it always be monthly?
Yeah. So when I first started getting into cash flow forecasting and modeling, it was largely when I got into turnaround and restructuring. And if you think about that environment, these are companies that are in bad shape. And oftentimes it's because there is a impending covenant violation. Maybe there's already a trip covenant. Maybe there's a loan default. Maybe there's a layoff. I mean, a company is in bad shape. And when a company is in bad shape, probably the number one area of focus needs to be cash flow. How do we stop the bleeding? What are the causes of bleeding? What are the near-term changes that we can make to have that be affected? And then how do we start to turn around operations and get back in the green? So to your point, Albert, is if you were to do that on a monthly basis, you're going to miss all of that detail. There's going to be too many moving parts, and you're not going to be able to come up with good answers. So just by default, the 13-week cash flow, which is arguably the gold standard because it's 3 months, it's a quarter of the year, makes a lot of sense for companies that are in really bad shape. I've been in some companies that are truly hemorrhaging, and it sometimes surprises people when I say, yeah, I used to do a daily cash flow, and I would do this for 2 to 4 weeks. I wouldn't even get to 13 weeks. And they said, well, what would you do beyond the month? I'm like, there's no guarantee we were even going to get past the month.
You're going to make payroll. Yeah, right.
Right. And then I also teach really, really hands-on cash flow programs. And I had a gentleman come through and he was very sheepish about this question. He says, Carl, I've just gone through this whole weekly program with you. I don't think we need to do weekly. Can we do monthly? I said, of course, you do whatever you need to do. Like, you don't have to do weekly if it's not helpful, but don't do monthly if it's too high level. And don't do daily if it's too detailed. And so when it comes to what intervals or what level of detail, again, it goes back to my answer of like, what do you need? What's helpful to you? What's the cost of being wrong? What's the cost of missing your numbers? If you, this was crazy. I was working with a woman at a hedge fund, like a Caribbean-based hedge fund, and their like materiality threshold was enormous. And I was like, wow, I can't believe you could have a variance miss and it wouldn't even get flagged. That's of that size. She's like, yeah, it just doesn't really matter. Whereas if you are in bankruptcy and you have a debtor in possession loan and a DIP budget, and you're off by a certain threshold, that gets flagged by the bankruptcy court.
Alarms going off. Yeah.
Right. So it really depends on what your needs are and what level of materiality truly matters. So I typically say if you're struggling with cash flow, focus on a weekly first, but then do an integration of a weekly and monthly. And then over time, as you start to turn things around, there's two things you can do. You can either go straight to the monthly and get rid of the weekly, or you can just update it less frequently. So rather than say I have a weekly that I'm updating every week, you could say I have a weekly that I'm updating every month, updating every 2 months. And then you can blend them together and you get a really beautiful picture of the business.
A lot of our audience, not just finance professionals, but business owners and a lot of people that we spend time with, typically what's going on with their cash flow cycles just upside down, right? I'm sure you see this a lot is once it's all right there in front of you, see we're spending more cash than we have coming in. Our outflows are exceeding our inflows week after week, month after month. What have you seen? What are the typical like big drivers? Like, hey, from an AR to AP, this is what we need to go do, like clockwork, it works every time?
I would simplify it and just say a lot of people just don't have visibility. It's not even necessarily an operations play because they can't even see what it is,
Right.
because they don't have the visibility. And so when putting together a cash flow forecast or cash flow model, I say that it starts out with two things. Is one, you have to build process. So it's not I'm building this cash flow and then, the next time I have to update, it's going to take me a week to do it because I didn't build a process. So you build the recurring process of what does it need to be connected with. And then again, you need to be able to present it and model it in a way that is useful. Then that usefulness, I often say, what I love. I remember I had a gentleman come through a cash flow experience with me, and he said, going through this, I came in wanting to learn how to use Excel and build a really good model. But what I'm leaving here with is really understanding that this is truly a diagnostic tool. And he's a fractional CFO. And he said, what this tool does is I can go into either brand new companies or my existing clients. I can put this thing together. And then what it's going to show me is what is driving all of the elements within my cash flow. And that's all operations. So you've got sales, you've got marketing, you've got purchasing, you've got operations, you've got warehousing, you've got hiring, you've got Capex, you've got everything. And the cash flow is just a barometer of what's causing the cash to move in the wrong direction or causing liquidity crises.
Right.
And then when it gives you that visibility of it's this that's driving, you now have a new engagement of, okay, let's focus on our purchasing cycle. Now you're over here. Okay, let's focus on our manufacturing cycle. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to bill our customers differently rather than just say, I talked to my mastermind group and all of these other customers are doing it this way, so I just followed suit. No, get creative, put those new scenarios into your model, simulate it, and then say, so this is what my cash flow is going to look like if I make these decisions. Now let's go make those decisions.
That's the next layer. I love that. Well, switching gears, you have another exciting topic that I love that you chatted about. And you wrote the other day, I think you posted, or maybe you said it. You said Capex planning, it should be modeled beyond the one line and a percent of revenue. I'm like, yes, because I can't tell you how many times I go into an asset intensive organization. It's like, let me see your Capex schedule. I'm like, well, no, what's that? We just have it. We just have a budget for it as a percent of revenue. And I saw that you wrote that. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can relate with that so much. Can you walk us through that? What does that look like to not just be the one liner? What is true Capex? What should it look like?
Yeah, so I'm not going to say that taking it as a percentage is necessarily wrong, but it probably is. I remember it was a big training company that trains people on this stuff, and I took a look at one of their models, and it did that, and I was like, for a operating model that you can't do that. Like that's so high level, and it gives no tangible connection between what's going on with revenue, what's going on with spend, and then also this most important part that I think you're getting at is what's the connection between the Capex investment and what it influences. And I hope that your audience understands this, but when you invest in Capex, it's not just a revenue play. So, you might say, I'm going to invest in a machine, so it's going to increase revenue. It might have nothing to do with revenue. It might have something to do with your efficiency. It might have to do with your hiring. It might have to do with being able to get into a new market that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get into. So while the percentage I think is okay to monitor, it's okay to benchmark against, it means nothing. It's more so, I think, for financial statement modeling versus actually operating modeling in FP&A. So it's really important. I wish I could show your audience this, but I go into companies and we create schedules, like quite literally itemized schedules of what is the Capex, what's the description, what's the date that it's going to go into service, what's the lead time. So instead of saying, we've got a $2.8 million machine that we're going to put in. Yeah, well, when are you going to order it? What's the lead time? Because that's going to influence the behaviors of all of your business partners. There may be deposits, there may be funding, there may be other parts of your business that are dependent on that order, and you need to know that gap. In addition, I often want to map the Capex of saying, okay, yes, this does tie to revenue, but this ties to payroll. This ties to marketing. This ties to software. This ties to materials. So you got to be able to say, if we turn on this CapEx, what line items get impacted? If we turn it off, what gets impacted? Going back to your initial point, if you're just saying like CapEx is 12% of revenue and you bring that up to 14%, so what? I mean, what does that mean? There's no tangible connection. And so we always suggest putting together a schedule that is much more transparent.
Love that. And I always get confused why those that do have a cash flow statement, why it wouldn't live within the outflows. And I always see it below the line. I'm like, well, it's still an outflow. Wouldn't you agree? And then to your point, not just from a revenue perspective, but I'm even thinking the depreciation and the tax implications that, when you do that.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
Switch that gear.
Yeah, you bet. I think that when a lot of people put together direct cash flows, they just make it very easy to see. And they just want to see what is net cash flow? And so sometimes I do recommend for like major CapEx projects, pulling it out and separating it so that you can say like, these are core operating cash flows. Okay. This is a little bit more discretionary. And because CapEx tends to be really big numbers, is you might say, all right, this is discretionary. We've got 1.8 million of discretionary expenditure.
Love it. Got it. Okay, good. I like that. I learned something there. I appreciate that. You started posting about this difference between FP&A versus controller. I think there's a lot of noise out there and a lot of tension. Where should the accountability sit? As you look at how really great teams divide work, what does that look like from a controller to the FP&A function?
Yeah. So I sometimes share a graphic where I show, chief financial officer up at the top, and then you've got controller and CFO reporting in. And what I think is really interesting is even in my work as FP&A advisory and fractional CFO work and working with private equity firms, is often what happens is you have a CFO who either came from an FP&A side or came from a controller side. And where there is sometimes a struggle is if the CFO comes from the controller side, it's largely a focus on reporting. It's not as strategic. It's not as dynamic. And so that's why I often come in, because I bring that other viewpoint. I see a controller as somebody who is your accounting specialist, somebody who is able to, elevate the accounting team and report cleanly, build your accounting processes, and make sure that data is flowing, not just to the accounting group, but also to FP&A. FP&A has to be able to leverage all of that data to be able to model, analyze, forecast, whatever you need to do. But that skill set and that mindset is often not what controllers grow up with. And I'll leave it just with this point here is I had a woman, she is in a leadership position at a pretty sizable regional CPA firm. She came through one of my fractional CFO workshops, and I remember we got on a call like a week later, and she says, Carl, I have a really serious, important question. We are investing a lot of effort and energy and growth into advisory services, particularly like the office of the CFO and FP&A advisory work, even though traditionally we've been doing audit and tax. And she says, do you think that it's possible to train controllers to think like FP&A people? Or do you think we have to go out and hire those people who actually come from that background? And I said, look, I think it's a case-by-case basis. But already in her question, she's saying we're really struggling with people who come from accounting backgrounds being okay with looking to the future and knowing in their forecast that they're instantaneously wrong. And I say that to people all the time, is the difference between accounting and FP&A is accounting, you've got right answers, and FP&A, you've got good guesses. So, how
do we challenge that? I mean, you're in the educational system, so I'm sure people benefit from your experience, your views here. How do we challenge the education system to teach differently so that there isn't this somewhat of a divide in how we, do execute here?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard answer, and even with my my grad students, they are mostly accountants, and even today I gave them an assignment that's due in a week, and there's no real perfect answer. And it can make them extremely uncomfortable because they come from undergrad where it's, you've got multiple choice questions, you've got right answers, you've got wrong answers. It's very objective. But once you get into our world where it's good guesses, it's helpful assumptions, it's putting some numbers together and hoping that they're good enough. Is this just challenging mindset to say, you've got the foundation of accounting, use it. I've got a degree in accounting as well as finance, but use that foundation, but realize what the business world is about. It's not always about certainty. It's not always about having the right answers. It's about taking the data that you have, making the most of it, and taking a step forward. And that's what business is. It's not about having perfect answers.
I like that, because it definitely relieves, at least in the conversation I have with financial professionals, I'm sure you have many of these, there is a little bit of angst with that responsibility of having the keys to the finances and the data and wanting things to be perfect and ultrasound. And granted, we want accuracy in forecasting, but I love what you just mentioned. That definitely relieves some of that pressure that I think is self-imposing. It's just the way we think, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's human nature.
Right.
Not necessarily that it's accounting versus finance. It's just human nature that we want to be right. We want to build our confidence. We want to reduce our risk. We don't like walking in the dark.
So I'm a big fan of three statement models, and you chat a lot about this. You actually say from a P&L forecasting into you jotted it down 5-4-4 weekly cash, right? The 13-week. Can you walk us through your mapping framework? Because not a lot of people do that. This connecting the dots between the three, your P&L, your balance sheet, and your cash flow statement.
Sure. There's a lot of ways that you can do three statement modeling. And part of what I share and part of what I hope to do just generally is to help people understand that there is not just one way to do things. That whatever you learned in school or whatever you learned in your first job, or whatever you learned in a training program is not just the way to do it. And when it comes to three statement modeling, when I first learned it, everything was just monthly. It was understanding the accounting equations, and that was it. And I quickly learned that just was not good enough for most of the companies that I was working in, is they needed to go far deeper, far more dynamic, greater visibility, and a lot of monthlies just don't do that for companies that need greater control over their plans. When I first started to make an augmentation away from just monthly connections basic to something more was when I first started getting into turnaround and restructuring. And going back to your question about 13-week cash flow, is if you think about what 13 weeks is, it's really generally three months, right? So you can say, all right, let me take this 13 weeks to month end. Let's just hypothetically say month end December 31st. Okay. So you've got 3 months all done weekly. But then after that, I sometimes challenge people. I say, Albert, if you were to, forecast your own personal cash balance in your bank account for the next 3 months, do you think you'd be able to do it? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I'll figure it out.
Yeah, you'd probably be pretty good. But then I say, Albert, what about forecasting your cash balance 12 months from now if you were to do it weekly? Would you be able to do that?
It'd be a little bit tougher.
Yeah, you'd say it's tough. It's not going to be accurate. There's going to be a lot of swings. I don't know. Right. And so that's why it makes sense to say, all right, well, let's do a weekly for the first few months. Naturally, gold standard, 13 weeks. Right. And then thereafter, have that build a monthly from month 4 to month 12. And then even after that, because some companies, manufacturing, construction, oil and gas, railways, big Capex companies, is they're going to say, great, 12 months, but what about our 3-year plan? What about our 5-year plan? I'm about to work with a company in the southeast part of the United States that wants to put together a 3 to 5 year plan. And so while it might start with some weekly, you have to go to monthly, and then thereafter you might be quarterly or probably just yearly. But the last piece I would add is, while my preferred structure is to build the weekly, then go to the monthly, what some companies want to do is they say, yeah, we'd like to see the weekly, but we just don't need the level of refinement of building a 13-week. So you can say, let me take my 12 months, let me divide the first 3 months by 13 weeks, and then let me time that the right way so that I can get a weekly visibility. It's not perfect. It's not always great, but it gives you more of a weekly cadence.
I've never asked this on any one of the episodes, and I'm curious about your thoughts because in a mature company with historical data and maybe even some data that we can see in the future, how does that change even with the cash flow statement when you're doing a startup company about to go to market launch? I mean, I'd imagine, and it's okay to say, there's just a lot of theoretical. We think this is what it's going to be. I mean, how do you make it more precise other than what you have, like you just the data that you have and some of the market
That's
analysis
that.
that
I
you did?
mean, I'll give two examples. I sometimes share this with people. I went into an organization that had garbage data, just not good. And it was an all hands on deck situation. It was very bad. I went in, spent some time with the CFO who gave me the data. And I'm like, this is just not good. It's not reliable. Nevertheless, I still used it. I put it into my model. But then, in contrast to what I would do with I don't want to say high integrity, but like a more buttoned up company where I could say, all right, I can rely on these numbers. Here's the model. Let's change the assumptions. Is I actually took my model and I went around the company to all of the department heads and I segmented my forecast by department. And so imagine for a moment that you're in operations. And I say, all right, Albert, you're chief of operations. Here is your forecast in your function. Here are the numbers that we had last year. I know that they're wrong. Where do you see where the big gaps are? Where do you see that it is most wrong? Where do you see that it's right? What assumptions do I need to make? And so even though you've got an all hands on deck situation and you have to come up with something, you leverage the intelligence that you've got. Some of that intelligence is going to come in the form of tangible data, but some of that intelligence is going to come from conversations from people who are smarter than you. And then when it comes to startups where there is no data, I sometimes say, like, think about Shark Tank, right? Where you've got a business owner who has not a lot of data, or there are even sometimes when an inventor comes on and the investors say, wait a second, you're pre-rev. Oh, you're not even a business yet. You're just an idea. You're pre-revenue. And the business owner says, yeah, that's right. And they say, tell us your assumptions. Tell us what your forecast is. So even the investors are saying, even in lieu of data, you have to come up with assumptions that are buttoned up, sound, that they're vetted, and that they make sense.
Right.
And if you think about the world where, small companies with bad information and not a lot of track record are going out and raising millions of dollars, sometimes it's based upon just speculation, what the business model is going to be, and the trust that you have in the owner.
Mm, yeah, that's huge. That last piece is a big one. We're actually going through, have a brand that I've announced it on some posts and some previous episodes, Alchemize House. We're going through that, right? So you have the financial, it's a startup, right? So there's things that we know pretty dang sure this is what's going to happen. There's also some, hey, based on what we have, this is what we think. And then we just have some amazing co-founders and we just hear it all the time. I trust in the owner, I trust in the founders. And it's so important. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, if you had to pick three non-negotiable FP&A skills over the next 5 years, and I know that's a while from now, but even with all these new tools, these AI tools, what should they be learning? How can people upskill?
I'll address that in a couple of ways. One, I recommend to everybody, no matter what their age, but particularly younger people who are starting out, is start learning Excel, not because it's the end all be all tool, but it's the sandbox. It's where you play. It's where you learn how to do stuff. And when you marry a background in finance and a background in accounting with, okay, I have to do this analysis. How do I actually do it? Well, you can't get out a pencil and paper and start, doing calculations. You got to have sand to be able to build the sandcastle. That's where you can do it. And what's great about Excel or even Google Sheets is you can audit everything that you do, and you don't have to be super advanced to be able to put something together. So I think that that's number one. Number two, which I am perhaps most fearful of because of AI, is critical thinking.
Hmm.
Even as I had just mentioned earlier in our discussion, is I gave an assignment to my grad students, and some of them are staring at me of like, wait a second, there's really no perfect answer. How am I supposed to do this if there's no perfect answer? And it's like, you got to use your brain. You have to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to them, I'm like, don't do your assignment like you're submitting it to me, the professor. Pretend for a moment that you're going to give it to a CFO. And if you give this to the CFO, they're going to poke holes in everything that you do and ask where you came up with this conclusion, where you got that data, why you assumed this. So get ready for those questions and answer them before the CFO even asks. So my concern about AI, and I was just reading an article this morning about this, is it was written by a really sharp high school student in a major periodical, and she says AI is ruining my high school education because she herself is driven, but she's surrounded by all these students who are, if you want to call it cheating, but shortcutting their education. And if you don't learn the critical thinking of what does the CFO care about, what is the global head of FP&A, what numbers are they going to spot that they're going to be really focused on? If you're taking a look at the financials and they're not balancing the right way, what kind of questions do you go to the controller with? That's not something that you plug into AI. It gives you the answer and you say, okay, well, I don't have a brain. AI is my brain. So
Right.
critical thinking is number two. And then number three, and I've shared this on some other podcasts, is the ability to anticipate. So FP&A is often about future planning and thinking about how decisions that are made today are going to materialize in the future, as well as how your expectations about what might manifest in the future impact what decisions you're going to make today. And I think that that's vital, is to, rather than say, oh, I'm focusing on cash flows for the next 3 months, it's, why not also think about cash flows for the next 3 years?
Right.
What's the company's strategy? How's it going to be hiring? What are going to be the implications of merging with the company that's in a different country? So when you blend anticipation of what I think is going to happen, what does it mean, with critical thinking of, I'm taking a look at my information, how do I interpret it, what are other people going to ask, and where are the risks, with the architecture of I can play in the sandbox of Excel, you've got a trifecta that I think is extremely valuable to FP&A.
Yeah, it's great advice, great points on just three different ways plus on how to upskill and what to go after. I love number two. I love the critical thinking piece. It was funny just the other day, and I'm a big fan of, hey, yeah, sure, use AI so long as we're using it securely and all of that, and we're following the right governance. But my question after the output, I'm like, okay, here's what I got. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm like, well, how'd you get that? How Tell me how that breaks. Like, how do we get to that conclusion? Well, no, that's what it told me. That's the recommendation it gave me. I'm like, that's not good enough. We can't,
Right.
the responsibility will not land on, hey, it was AI and, see you later.
No.
Like, no,
Right.
that's not happening. So
Yeah. I mean, I think about, like, if I was a fractional CFO at a company and a staff member said that to me, of like, oh, I got it from I would hesitate not to get very livid in that moment.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like, tell me how, like, what is the
Right.
fundamentals of what led to this? How do we know it's accurate and walk us through? And so I think that's my only fear too, is do we lose the fundamental piece? Right. But I love the way you're
I think it's an
posing it
important
too.
question. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the way you're posing it though, is you got to think. Let me give you this question of this assignment. You got to think the way through. It actually reminds me earlier on in my math days, this proofs. I used to always wonder,
Yeah.
like, why do I got to show the proof? I know the answer. Now I'm like,
Yeah.
we're bringing it back. Like, give me the proof. I
Yeah.
want to say, I actually do like that about AI and some of the more complex things that it does. It actually shows you, Albert
Yeah.
wants me to do this. This is what I'm going to go do. And it's
Hmm.
researching. And so it's so fun.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up proofs. My I've got young kids, and they're able to get to the right answers, but they're not showing their work, and the teachers are getting upset with them, and they're like, "Why do I need to show my work? I know how to get to the answer." And to your point, and I mean, it's kind of funny to see myself in my kids, because when I was young, I was the same. I'm like, who cares if I
Exactly.
got to it a different way? I got to the right answer, and it's like, no, it's about your thinking, it's about your logic, it's about how you got there, not just that you
Proofs
got there.
proofs are making a comeback. I love it. I love it. So you also talk about scenario planning, and I know we're coming up to time, so this is, I'll make this one quick, but I love what you mentioned earlier around just testing and simulating. I used a tool the other day and I was blown away. It's called Scan AI. But is there anything out there that you'd recommend that works really well with Excel on scenario based modeling or planning or even simulations?
I mean, a lot of the FP&A tools out there, and I'm not going to advocate for one over another, but most of the tools can do that, and I think that it's vital in that you can come up with your best case of what you think is going to happen, but you've got to be able to flex your assumptions in real time and be able to have confidence that you're getting good results. So whether you're doing that in Excel or Google Sheets or something more formal in an FP&A platform, those should be present. And if they're not, then that tool's probably not as robust as it should be.
Makes sense. Well, my last question to you, sir, very curious. You work with some world-class brands. So what have you found distinguishes teams that turn FP&A from what people think sometimes like this reporting, dashboarding, right? Just modeling to an actual strategy function or department?
There's a few things. So, one, a lot of this has to do with empowerment and enablement of the company says, yes, we want you to adopt these mindsets. We want you to be proactive. We're going to invest in you. We're going to give you the resources. We're going to hire teams to support this. So a lot of that just comes from buy-in from leadership and culture that's very strong. I mean, you've probably gone into some companies where it's like you see a weak CFO, you see a cryptic culture, and people are quiet, not speaking up, and not taking things as far as they probably could. I was with a company, I mean, earlier this year, and I was just stunned how I was with probably about a dozen FP&A professionals asking these not difficult questions, but they were staring at me almost like they needed approval from their boss to open their mouth. And that's just the sign of not a very good culture and where you've got probably very talented people who are being inhibited. In addition, I think that, while the Excel and the modeling and the analysis is all super important, FP&A and the term, business partnership is critical. So business partnership essentially means the relationship between a finance professional and I would argue, a non-financial professional. And in many companies, you'll have FP&A that's entrenched in operations, entrenched in HR, entrenched in sales. So they might be like an HR financial business partner or an operations financial business partner. And so they're not necessarily just a finance person. They also understand the implications and connections of non-financial activities on the financials of the business. And I think where we're going to continue to go more and more is where it's not like we've got our accounting function, we have our finance function, and they just sit at like the HQ level without really a direct line of sight to these other groups. What I sometimes say is FP&A is like the financial control tower. They're elevated. They can see into these other groups, and they're giving information to those groups. They're receiving information from those groups, and they're really almost like a junior CFO instead of just a senior level accountant.
Right. Well, I even love it too when, hey, walk down from the tower and get into the field to really feel it.
You bet.
From the user point of view, the team member point of view.
Totally.
To in the field. I love
that. Yeah.
Well, Carl, thank you so much. Like I said, this is a dream come true. I've watched so many of your episodes, your posts, your demos, your LinkedIn master classes and educational material. I wish I was in your classroom. It would be amazing. So thank you so much for this. Where can people learn more about you? How can they take any of your courses that you've put out there on LinkedIn, and how can they connect with you better?
Yeah, so I have a website, seidmanfinancial.com. We have all kinds of resources and writing, also access to all of the masterminds and workshops that we do. A lot of those take place live and in public, so anyone can do it. We also do a whole lot corporate, so if anyone's interested in learning what we do on site private or virtually too, they can learn there. And then also on LinkedIn, we share content almost every single day to hopefully make people's lives a little bit easier, save them time, eliminate mistakes. And then also it's been fun creating a lot of LinkedIn learning courses of taking the skills and experiences that I've learned over 2 decades of a career, making them easy for an average person to understand and hopefully make a whole lot of difference in a very short amount.
So good. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I will say, I'm not going to edit this out. I just want to apologize to you in public that I said Seidman and not Seidman. So
no worries.
Never make that mistake again.
No worries. I've been getting that my whole life. Not a big deal at all.
Well, I appreciate you. Thanks for the grace. Well, everybody, thank you so much. I hope you learned a ton, and you go and check out Carl's content. There's so much educational material. This has been another episode of the ValSites podcast. Again, I'm your host, Albert Ramos, and we'll see you next time every Monday, 8 a.m. Central. Carl, thank you so much.
Thank you, Albert.
My pleasure.